Welcome to Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to resilience, business continuity, disaster planning, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Today, we are going to be talking about two different topics. In our first segment, we're going to be talking about the role of business continuity in international security. And I'd like to welcome to the show today, Kyle King. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Now, I know we've had emails back and forth, so I know who you are and what you do. Could you take a minute or two and just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into this industry?
Sure, absolutely. So I started out my career a number of years ago in the emergency services. So I come out of the response side of the house. I spent 17 years in the U.S. Department of Defense Fire and Emergency Services. But then I actually transitioned and started doing a lot of international work. And I was hired as a civil emergency advisor for NATO to support international operations. And then I also started a lot of international work in sort of crisis management, and then also worked for the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. And then currently, I'm the managing director of Capacity Building International, which is our consultancy firm, small boutique consultancy firm that supports U.S. government efforts in terms of international resilience and crisis management support. And then also the founder of Crisis Lab, our new online professional development platform.
Oh, well, welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to our topic today. Actually, both of them, but the first one is about the business continuity in international security. Now, I got to be honest, I hear about business continuity and security, but usually it's cybersecurity or information security. However, this is a different twist, international security. So how does business continuity fit into that?
Yeah, I think it's a great topic, and it's a great question to sort of dive into. And one of the reasons that I think this is going to be a growing issue is because on the international security space, we're seeing obviously a lot of changes in the geopolitical climate, sort of a lot of changes in the international security space in terms of, what's happened in the last couple of years with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, sort of the issues in the Red Sea impacting overall trade and supply routes. And then we have issues such as, just for example, you mentioned cyber, but you have, for example, ships dropping anchor in the Baltic Sea, trying to pull up underwater sea cables and threatening lines of communication. So while these are all predominantly national security issues, there are also, obviously international security issues, but there's been a growing realization, I think more important to your question, a growing realization in the last few years, and especially since 2022, that all these international security mechanisms, NATO and everybody else, are highly dependent upon private sector, highly dependent upon the critical infrastructure, telecom providers, private sector entities to do contracting, to provide what we call host nation support, fuel, meals, logistics, things like that to support military operations. And so from the international security space, there's a growing recognition that business continuity is going to be a key integrator in terms of supporting military operations and also thereby national and international security. So it's a space that a lot of international organizations are really starting to get into. Maybe a little bit late, but they're certainly waking up to it and starting to get involved now.
So what are some of the things that business continuity professionals need to look at then? Because it seems over the years, business continuity is just growing by leaps and bounds, and one person just can't cover everything. Because a lot of us are departments of one, let's face it.
Exactly. And it is, I think in terms of business continuity, emergency management, crisis management, all these sort of correlating fields, I think we are underinvested. And I think there's a growing realization that if we want to ensure that, for example, if there was a war in Europe, that the infrastructure is in place, the critical infrastructure is in place, that telecommunications providers can operate under stress, under duress, and that they're able to deliver these services not only to the public, which is their key sort of target demographic, but also in terms of the supporting military operations and the increased burden and load that goes along with that. And it reminds me of when I was recently in Riga in Latvia, and we were having a conversation, sort of hypothetical discussions about, okay, what if there were say NATO forces coming in to support Latvia, and you're talking to city managers and others in terms of what they would be able to handle in terms of capacity. And there's a sort of a shocking realization that the entire world could change overnight, and we're not really prepared to provide all this additional support and services and continuity of operations that are required from the public sector. I mean, the latest statistic and you probably know better than I do, but what 80-90% of critical infrastructure is in the private sector hands. But that's what we need to move and mobilize military forces. And so this is where I think the more the narrative changes, to your question directly, I think the more the narrative changes, we hope to see more emphasis on programs like business continuity so that they can be invested in, that is taken to a higher level, more strategic level, and becomes a higher priority.
So what components of business continuity specific? I can't imagine, us talking about doing a BIA, a business impact assessment, when you're talking on international security. But there's got to be other components then that do reach out and touch some of the topics that you've just mentioned.
Oh, absolutely. So if we're looking at, for example, probably most companies don't have like conflict in their risk mitigation profiles, but that could be something that they could start to look at, especially if you're in, say, the Baltic states, and that's becoming more of a prevalent issue. You're looking at operational continuity in terms of how are we going to sustain our operations, even though we're having issues in terms of security issues, or even if we have to bolster and support tens of thousands of more sort of customers in our telecommunications operations. And then we have really interagency sort of coordination and support, so that public-private partnership is going to be a real key integrator. And that's something that actually NATO is starting to really have a conversation about, is this public-private partnership initiative and how we can leverage that to enhance NATO's own mobility and capability. So I would say those are three just basic areas that sort of the normal operations you're going through anyway can also be looked at through a different lens to see how they could scale and support international efforts.
The public and private partnerships, would that be like third parties? As the way it's called in business continuity right now is third party management or vendor management type things. But this seems to be, in this case, bigger than that, right? We're not dealing with, the gas station down the street who will give us, some diesel for our generator type thing. It seems to be much bigger than that. So can you expand on that a little bit more?
Sure, absolutely. And so when we talk about public-private partnership, at least from an international security perspective, which is obviously, I think, bit more strategic, right, in terms of those relationships, but it's looking at the sources of vendors, vendor supply chain sustainability, and even during times of conflict, making sure that the legal framework and legislation is in place within each nation to make sure that they're able to have that sort of defense industrial base capability, and also that the contract mechanisms are there. That you can have companies that are readily standing by to be able to support operations, provide much needed logistics capability, communications and facilities and critical infrastructure. And all these systems are already in place and designed so that they don't have to be done on the fly or when a crisis actually occurs. So the entire infrastructure, so to speak, quote unquote, this legislative, contractual framework and infrastructure, and especially the relationships between national governments and entities, the various internationally, we'd say like Ministry of Defense, but in the US or somewhere else, Department of Defense, all these contracting mechanisms are in place. They can move rapidly and execute quickly upon activation. So that type of relationship takes a lot of previous coordination. It also requires an extensive discussion around what is actually required from the private sector, because you can't keep everything in additional supplies and just in stock, right? There's all sorts of issues with that. So that requires an engaging discussion, a long-term discussion, just to see what the actual requirements are to be able, if you're a private sector entity, to be able to support your national security efforts. And so that's where that conversation tends to go, is more about the legal framework, the contractual obligations, and then what are the actual requirements to support.
So how do you get this started then? Because I can't help but thinking business continuity tends to look, I don't want to say inwards, but you're trying to protect your organization, or your community. So you're looking at your third parties and you're doing your impact assessments and things like that. But you're not looking at international security. So is it organizations like NATO that needs to approach these organizations and private partnerships, or is it the private organizations should be reaching out to places like NATO to say, hey, I've got something that can help you? Like, where does that start? How do you bring that together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So NATO itself, as an international sort of organization, is not going to approach individual companies that are dealing with a
Mm,
national security level issue, right? So that trickles
yeah.
down. So we NATO would agree in alliance that this is an important issue, and then nations would go forward, and then they would have discussions with their own Department of Defense or Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Internal Affairs, or in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security or FEMA, have these discussions about additional requirements and how to fill those requirements, and so that would trickle down. But if we look at it from the reverse and the bottom up process, when at the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, what was the role that like private sector was playing in terms of continuity of government with, when the war broke out? Like, what was Microsoft doing specifically? What was Amazon doing? And if you start to look at what these companies were doing to mobilize, protect their employees in this contingency planning format inside of a business continuity sort of umbrella, how do they protect their employees? How do they move their operations out of country? How do they protect and sustain their data, their information, everything that goes along with that? And so, these larger companies were already planning and had to put forth all this sort of steps to be able to prepare for a potential conflict. And so what we're starting to see is like there's a growing realization from a private sector that we need to be a little bit more forward linking in the way that thinking in the way that we look at business continuity and maybe widen the spectrum of issues we might have to deal with. At the same time, we're trying to push that narrative down a little bit beyond NATO into the nations and into the various different international programs, saying, hey, private sector is really important if you want to have a whole of society approach to sort of conflict prevention and sort of societal resilience.
Maybe it's just me, but that sounds like it could take a long time.
Very long time. And so I mean, that's the truth. I mean, NATO's been circling around sort of the idea of resilience for a few years now. And there's a summit coming up, or it's going to be in mid 2024, where we expect to see some more discussions coming out around it. But there's initiatives about the private sector that's coming up as well. And specifically, they're starting to call out, for example, business continuity and its role in terms of supporting just overall national security, not just to mention sort of private sector, but community and the states, state, federal level security as well.
Well, that's interesting. If their business continuity cropped up on their agenda or as a topic, how did that come about? Because you already mentioned earlier on, there is this divide, and we talked about that, but trying to bring them together. So was there a specific event or something that has happened that got business continuity on the radar of places like NATO?
I don't think it was really one thing. I think it was a combination of a couple of factors. One, the pandemic highlighted supply
Hmm.
chain resilience, and also the issue behind sort of medications and everything else that goes along with that, manufacturing and pharmaceuticals. And so that highlighted private sector sort of relationships, supply chain resilience. And then you're moving from 2020 into 2022, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which highlighted then again, well, it just sort of expanded and blew up that topic a bit more, because now it wasn't just sort of medical supply chain resilience and private
Hmm.
sector along the healthcare sector, but it was really everything else. It was communications, it was infrastructure, roads, bridges, everything that goes along with that. And that prompted just a significant amount of discussion and sort of an awakening into the idea of just how dependent we are upon the private sector, and therefore by extension, really business continuity. These businesses need to be able to sustain themselves even in the most sort of difficult times if we are actually looking at how we can support defense of our own nation.
It sounds like well, definitely the scope of business continuity seems to be growing, but also the way the business continuity is going to be viewed is being thought of differently, because you mentioned, building roads and things like that. Well, that's never really come in. That's nowhere in ISO 22301. That's nowhere in the professional practices or the good practice guidelines, from DRI and BCI. So it seems as though the profession is being looked at a little bit differently and thought of differently now.
I would agree. I think that for many years it's been, as you said, it's sort of an inward perspective, right? How do we ensure that we are adequately prepared for any sort of business disruptions? And so now it's not only just internal, but it's like, how can you really sustain operations in support of a greater effort. And that's changing the narrative a bit. Still extremely vital to focus internally on internal procedures and sustaining these operations and everything that goes along with that. But it's not just it's no longer just about the company anymore. It's also flipped a little bit to where it's like the company as a contributor to a national effort. And that's where I think we're taking on a slightly different perspective in that regard.
Yeah, that's interesting because I don't think a lot of companies, think of themselves as uh, on a national level. Even if they're a global country, they're not looking at some of the topics that you brought up. They're looking at keeping their operations running within the organization. But if it's looking at security on a different level, a nation's security and well-being and the general populace, rather than just employees, that's really changing the mindset of what we need to view business continuity as. That really is moving from business continuity to resilience thinking.
It is. And I think in some sectors they're doing it already or they have done it for a long time. If you take the banking sector, for example, I mean, obviously there's a key issue there in terms of the financial sector and banking
Mhm.
systems and structures. But you do have, and there's been all sorts of studies on the banking sector and conflict, especially with regards to Ukraine and what happened. But if you look across the board, you've got these major banks, but you also have smaller banks, smaller credit unions, smaller, regional banks and everything else. And they are contributors to community resilience and security. So if there's a disruption there, then that also really has a tremendous impact on people to be able to get money out of the bank.
Yeah.
And so my point with saying that is that you don't have to be a Microsoft level corporation to contribute to security, right? And so there's
Mm.
sort of key roles, especially as if you go down to the community level, because as we say, all disasters are local, but all conflict is also local, right? Everything happens at that local level and impacts the community the most. So even small businesses who are contributing to community resilience have a key role to play, in my opinion.
You mentioned, because you were talking about financial institutions, and I know the EU has their operational resilience pieces coming out. I know the US government is looking at it. Canada has stuff coming out in November, I believe it is, from OSFI, the Financial Institution Office that oversees all the FIs here. And the UK has theirs. Is some of the standards that are coming out and guidelines that are coming out from around the globe, is that also driving some of this change in thinking?
Yeah, I believe so. I think that there are, in terms of NATO, there's guidelines that would come out just in terms of, because NATO's and as an international organization can't dictate anything to anybody as an
Mhm.
alliance. So, but they issue guidelines. Guidelines are a consensus, sort of agreed guidelines that go out to every nation for them to look at and see if they can adopt. But below that subset at a national level, you're exactly right. There's more. We're seeing a growing emphasis on the need for business continuity, especially as it applies to local, national, and international security. So these guidelines that are coming out sort of reinforcing these different ideas. And I think that's a narrative that's been developing for some time. The EU has been issuing out guidance. They have sort of critical infrastructure guidance coming out. And there's a growing realization across multiple domains that we need to sort of strengthen these various different, we call them baselines to a certain extent, these functional areas in order
Mhm.
to have a more uh, stable and secure society.
What are some of the key points with regards to these guidelines and things that are coming out? Like what with NATO and the summit that you mentioned that's coming up, what are some of the key things they want to address right off the bat? Because there's so much in business continuity, and everyone can talk about different aspects of it, until we're all blue in the face. But there must be some key points that they are pointing out right off the bat, especially on an international security level.
So the way that NATO views resilience, and this is broader than just the business continuity aspect, but I think, in my opinion, business continuity is ingrained and integrated into each one of these. So
Mhm.
NATO has certain what we call resilience baselines, and that's food security, water security, population movement, mass casualty, telecommunications, transportation. These certain functional areas that we always look at. In fact, if you're familiar with community lifelines, there's a direct parallel between those, the community lifelines from FEMA in the United States, between those and the same topics with NATO. And so if you were to just dive a little bit deeper into the community lifelines and you go look at the sub sector of the community lifelines and look at these different sections and you see okay, in energy, there's gas, there's fuel, there's all sorts of different sectors within inside that lifeline. These are all areas where the private sector is heavily involved, and that requires continuity of operations, whether that's from a disaster or anywhere else. And so that is where it's the continuity of operations piece. It's going to be a an issue of continuity of sort of services and supplies, capabilities of supply chain resilience, the ability to continue to provide services even in austere environments. Obviously, there's an aspect of cyber inside of that as well, which you're already well versed in. But so there's the information domain, there's foreign direct investment in terms of the private sector. And so there's all sorts of different aspects that we have that NATO's looking at across the board very broadly. But the thing that I would communicate today and with you is, like, as you're a business continuity specialist, is really that all of this drives down to that community level in these individual businesses. So while they're saying, okay, transportation, what's the impact in the community with the transportation sector and who's involved in that? And that's when we start to really see business continuity, resilience, public-private partnership become key integrators.
It's really understanding all these dependencies and how we all work together for a greater good. If we have an issue, our issue isn't really just restricted to us. Because of our dependencies, we impact other companies, other people, communities, and sometimes, even on a greater scale. It's understanding how all that works together, right?
Absolutely. And so that's a way that many of the nations are going now, is looking at sort of a systems thinking approach to it and looking at how many things are connected. And it's really been highlighted in the last couple of years when we look at how far have we come since the civil defense era, and then how many dependencies have we created? How resilient are our supply chains? And do we really have a national capability to mobilize, to move, to operate? And these are some of the big questions that nations are fighting with these days.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, always hearing about civil defense and the community groups and things like that. I don't hear as much about that today. I don't know why it disappeared, but maybe it's time to bring some of that back so that we do understand how things are working together and how we work together and our impacts. No person is
Absolutely.
right.
And I think it's coming slowly but surely. It's coming. Some sort of Eastern Europe's already sort of moving to a wartime footing. There's a lot of discussion about public education in schools for preparedness. But we haven't seen that exactly in the U.S. yet, because the U.S. is very unique in terms of its geographic location. But we're not going to go directly back to civil defense, but I think you'll see a modified version coming out pretty soon.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end of this segment talking about business continuity and international security. Kyle, lots of great stuff there, and I really would be interested in seeing what happens and comes out of this summit in the summertime to find out what NATO and some of these other groups have to say about business continuity.
Yeah, absolutely. When something comes out, I'll certainly reach out to you and we can have another chat.
Oh, would love it. On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. Today, we are talking with Kyle King, and we will be right back. If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.